That question has been quietly echoing for years. Whispered in comment sections, murmured in late-night forums, dismissed as ridiculous, then suddenly resurfacing again. Louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. Because what if one of the most emotionally charged narratives of the modern monarchy, the pregnancy, the birth, the photographs, the official announcements, wasn't as straightforward as it appeared? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if the story the world accepted without hesitation is now being re-examined not because of malice, but because of contradictions that refuse to disappear? This is not a verdict. This is not a declaration of truth. This is a reckoning with questions that never stopped being asked. For years, anyone who dared raise doubts was immediately labeled cruel, conspiratorial, or obsessed. And yet the questions persisted. Quietly at first, then collectively, then insistently. Why? Because stories don't unravel unless there's tension pulling at the seams. And right now, those seams are under more strain than ever. Short, punchy thought. Something doesn't add up. Longer breath. In the modern age of the monarchy, nothing is supposed to be opaque. Every movement documented. Every announcement calibrated. Every image curated to reassure the public that tradition, stability, and transparency still matter. So when something feels different, not wrong, but different, people notice. And once people notice, they don't stop looking. This story matters now because we are living in a moment where trust itself is under review. Institutions that once relied on silence now struggle against the permanence of digital memory. Old footage resurfaces. Archived statements are reread with new eyes. Language choices that once felt harmless suddenly feel deliberate. And when the palace speaks, or doesn't, people listen harder than ever. Let's be clear about one thing from the beginning. There are no proven conclusions here. There are no confirmed revelations. There is no final judgment. What exists instead is a growing archive of inconsistencies, interpretations, unanswered questions, and human reactions to a narrative that was once considered untouchable. And the reason this conversation has reignited isn't because of one rumor. It's because of timing. Because legal battles elsewhere have reminded the public how carefully narratives can be constructed. Because other royal controversies have shown how much is hidden behind protocol. Because a generation raised on social media no longer accepts "just trust us" as an answer. And because the palace itself has changed its tone over time, subtly, quietly, but noticeably. Ask yourself this. If nothing were questionable, why would so many people still be asking? The introduction of Meghan Markle into the royal family was always framed as historic. A modern love story. A break from centuries of rigidity. A symbol of progress wrapped in elegance and optimism. From the beginning, the spotlight was intense. Every outfit dissected. Every gesture analyzed. Every word weighed. And when the pregnancy was announced, it was supposed to be a moment of collective joy. A continuation of the fairy tale. A distraction from the growing tension between the Sussexes and the rest of the institution. But here's where things become complicated. Because joy does not cancel scrutiny. And symbolism does not erase precedent. Royal pregnancies are among the most documented human events on Earth. Not because of obsession, but because they represent continuity. The future of an institution built on lineage. That's why the rules exist. That's why traditions matter. That's why deviations stand out. And this pregnancy, according to critics, deviated. Not in one dramatic way. Not in a single undeniable moment. But in a series of small, accumulating differences that some observers say never fully aligned with what came before. A missing photograph here. A shifted timeline there. An announcement phrased just oddly enough to invite interpretation. On their own, each detail seems insignificant. Easy to dismiss. Harmless. Together, they form a pattern that some believe deserves examination, not ridicule. And that's where this story becomes less about one woman, one family, or one birth. And more about how modern narratives are protected, challenged, and sometimes weaponized. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Questioning a story does not automatically mean denying a person's humanity, but refusing to acknowledge questions does not make them disappear either. For years, mainstream media largely avoided this topic, not because they were unaware, but because the risks were enormous. Legal threats, social backlash, accusations of cruelty, Silence became safer than curiosity. And yet silence has consequences. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. Online communities began compiling footage, comparing dates, rewatching interviews, re-examining public appearances, not to prove something definitively, but to understand why the official narrative felt incomplete to them. Some were respectful, some were obsessive, some crossed lines. But the existence of bad actors does not invalidate all questions. Here's where emotions come in. Because for supporters of Meghan Markle, these rumors feel deeply personal. An attack on womanhood, on motherhood, on privacy, on mental health. And those feelings are valid. At the same time, for skeptics, the resistance to transparency feels like manipulation. Like being told to accept something without evidence simply because questioning it is uncomfortable. And that tension, that emotional collision, is why this story never settled. It stayed suspended, waiting. Now add one more ingredient. Language. Institutions reveal more through wording than through declarations. What they clarify, what they avoid, what they choose not to correct. Over time, palace statements related to the Sussexes began to sound different, more cautious, more legalistic, less warm. And in one particular moment, a phrase, a clarification, a denial that didn't deny what people expected it to, everything reignited. People latched onto words like they were clues in a mystery novel. There was no birth. What did that mean? Who said it? In what context? And why did it resonate so strongly? That phrase alone doesn't prove anything. But its existence reopened every old question that had been buried under outrage and fatigue. And once reopened, they spread again. Faster this time. Because now the audience is older, more skeptical, less trusting of both media and monarchy. Because now people know how narratives are managed, how images are staged, how statements are lawyered. And because now, after years of chaos, people are less afraid to say, I don't understand this, and I want to. This introduction is not here to convince you of anything. It's here to invite you into a process. A careful, uncomfortable, emotionally charged examination of how this story unfolded, why it triggered such intense reactions, and why, regardless of what you believe, it refuses to fade away. Throughout this series, we will separate allegation from fact, rumor from record, emotion from evidence. We will explore why certain traditions exist, why breaking them matters, and why sometimes breaking them doesn't mean what critics think it means. We will look at both sides, not equally, but honestly, and we will ask questions that many are afraid to ask out loud, not because answers are guaranteed, but because pretending the questions don't exist has never worked. So before we move forward, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, do you believe institutions always tell the full truth? Do you believe individuals never shape narratives in their favor? Do you believe questioning power is cruelty or responsibility? Because how you answer those questions will shape how you hear everything that comes next. And it all starts with a single moment. A pause button, a screenshot, a clip replayed one too many times. The moment some say the story began to crack. And once that crack appeared, nothing was ever seen the same way again. What was it that made people stop, rewind, and stare at the screen a second time? Because controversies don't usually begin with headlines. They begin with hesitation. A finger hovering over the pause button. A feeling you can't quite explain. That quiet moment when your brain says, wait, did you see that too? That was the real beginning. Not a rumor. Not a blog post. Not a viral thread. At first, it wasn't dramatic. It rarely is. The earliest questions didn't come from tabloids or critics with an agenda. They came from ordinary viewers watching routine footage, news clips, walkabouts, carefully framed public appearances that were supposed to feel reassuring and celebratory. And then someone paused a video. Maybe it was the way a coat fell. Maybe it was a gesture. Maybe it was a movement that didn't align with expectation. On its own, meaningless. But meaning doesn't emerge in isolation. It emerges in repetition. The clip was replayed, then slowed, then compared to another clip from a different day, then another, and slowly, without any declaration or manifesto, a question formed. Why does this look inconsistent? Notice the language. Not wrong, not fake, just inconsistent. That distinction matters. Because the first people asking questions weren't claiming certainty. They were expressing confusion. And confusion is contagious. One comment became 5. 5 became 50. 50 became entire threads filled with timestamps, side-by-side images, and people asking the same thing in slightly different ways. Am I imagining this? Is this normal? Did anyone else notice? Here's where the psychology shifts. Once a group of people realizes they're not alone in noticing something, curiosity turns into investigation. Not malicious investigation. Amateur investigation. The kind born from pattern recognition, not vendetta. And the internet is very good at patterns. The earliest forums weren't aggressive. They were cautious. People hedged every sentence. Used phrases like, I might be wrong, and this could be nothing. But the posts didn't stop. Because every time someone said, this is nothing, someone else would reply with another clip. Another photo. Another date that didn't line up the way they expected. And slowly, a narrative gap opened. Here's an uncomfortable truth that often gets ignored. Most conspiracy theories don't begin with wild ideas. They begin with unanswered questions. And those questions grow when institutions don't respond. In the early stages, mainstream media ignored the chatter entirely. Why wouldn't they? Online speculation happens every day. Most of it burns out within hours. But this didn't. Because the people asking questions weren't just anonymous accounts. They were longtime royal watchers, historians, mothers, medical professionals offering general observations, not diagnoses. Fashion analysts commenting on tailoring choices. Different backgrounds. Same confusion. And that's when the tone began to change. The questions stopped being, is this nothing? And started becoming, why hasn't this been addressed? That shift is critical. When an institution is trusted, silence is interpreted as dignity. When trust erodes, silence feels like avoidance. Ask yourself this. If you notice something that didn't make sense in a highly publicized event, wouldn't you expect clarity? Or at least acknowledgement? But there was none. Instead, the story moved forward at full speed. New appearances, new interviews, new narratives layered on top of old ones without ever resolving the questions beneath. And unresolved questions don't disappear. They harden. Now, let's talk about contradiction. Because contradiction doesn't mean falsehood. It means tension between expectations and reality. Royal pregnancies have conditioned the public to expect a certain rhythm, a timeline, a set of rituals that signal continuity and legitimacy. So when that rhythm changes, people feel off balance. Some defended the changes immediately. She deserves privacy. Times are different now. Tradition isn't law. All valid arguments. But here's the contradiction. The same people who argued for privacy also celebrated publicity when it suited the narrative. Carefully curated images, strategic releases, emotional interviews. So which was it? Privacy or presentation? Because you can't demand one while fully leveraging the other without inviting scrutiny. That contradiction became fuel. And the internet doesn't run on patience. It runs on curiosity gaps. One particularly circulated clip, still debated to this day, became a turning point. Not because it proved anything, but because it didn't align with what viewers believed they were seeing elsewhere. It wasn't dramatic. No scandalous moment. Just a subtle visual inconsistency that some viewers couldn't reconcile. They asked questions, were dismissed, asked again, mocked, and something interesting happened next. More people started looking, not because they believed a theory, but because they were told not to. Human psychology doesn't respond well to prohibition, especially when the prohibition feels emotional rather than factual. Don't ask, don't speculate, don't even look. That kind of response doesn't close conversations. It radicalizes them. Soon, compilations began circulating. Not sensational videos with dramatic music, just raw footage stitched together chronologically. No narration, no conclusion, just comparison. And comparison is dangerous when narratives rely on cohesion. Some viewers walked away unconvinced. Others walked away unsettled. A few walked away obsessed. But no one walked away indifferent. And that's the key point. Indifference is what kills rumors. Engagement keeps them alive. Then came the labels. Anyone asking questions was branded cruel. Anyone expressing doubt was accused of hatred. Anyone trying to analyze details was lumped in with the most extreme voices. That strategy backfired. Because when moderate skeptics are treated like extremists, they stop moderating themselves. They dig deeper. And what they dug into wasn't gossip. It was protocol. Old press releases. Archived palace announcements. historical birth records, patterns from previous royal generations. And that's when the discussion moved from, "Did you see that?" to, "Why is this different?" Difference alone isn't evidence, but unexplained difference invites interpretation. Let's pause here and be honest. Is it fair to scrutinize a woman's body? No. Is it understandable that people scrutinize public narratives when institutions have a history of secrecy? Yes. Those two truths coexist uncomfortably, and the internet is not good at nuance. What started as curiosity slowly mutated into camps: believers, skeptics, and a large group in the middle who simply felt something was off but didn't know what to do with that feeling. The palace, meanwhile, stayed silent. No clarification, no acknowledgement, no effort to contextualize deviations from tradition, just forward motion. And that silence became the loudest sound in the room. Here's the part many people miss. If the palace had addressed even one minor question early, not defensively, not emotionally, just factually, this story might have ended years ago. Instead, silence created space. Space for speculation. Space for interpretation. Space for the narrative to escape institutional control. And once a narrative escapes, it doesn't come back easily. As the Sussexes' relationship with the royal family deteriorated publicly, every unresolved question became retroactively suspicious. People began rereading the past through the lens of conflict. Were things hidden to protect privacy or to protect reputation? Were deviations personal choices or strategic necessities? Were questions dismissed because they were baseless or because they were inconvenient? Those questions didn't need answers to be powerful. They just needed to exist. And now, years later, they still do. The moment the internet started asking questions wasn't loud. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't organized. It was human. And once that curiosity crossed a certain threshold, it became impossible to contain. Because here's the irony. The more aggressively people were told not to question the story, the more they questioned the systems that demanded silence. And that shift, from questioning an event to questioning an institution, is where things truly changed. Because once trust in the narrator erodes, every story they tell gets re-examined, including this one. And the next chapter begins exactly there. With tradition. Because when people started comparing this pregnancy not to rumor, but to every royal pregnancy that came before it, the questions stopped being emotional and started becoming structural. Why do traditions exist in the first place? That's the question that quietly took over once people stopped replaying clips and started pulling out history books. Because when something feels different, the instinctive next step isn't accusation, it's comparison. And that's exactly where this story went next. Chapter 2 opens with a realization that hit many observers at the same time. Royal pregnancies aren't just personal milestones. They're institutional events. They're not owned solely by the parents. They belong, in part, to the monarchy itself, a centuries-old system obsessed with continuity, legitimacy, and public reassurance. That's why patterns exist. That's why rituals repeat. That's why deviation doesn't go unnoticed. So when people began comparing this pregnancy to those that came before it, the question wasn't, is something wrong? It was simpler. Why does this one follow a different rulebook? Look back across generations, and the rhythm is strikingly consistent. Public confirmation from the palace. Clear medical oversight acknowledged without invading privacy. Hospital announcements timed with precision. Visual continuity that reassures the public the system is functioning exactly as intended. This isn't about spectacle. It's about stability. The monarchy survives by making the extraordinary feel orderly. And historically, that order has been almost obsessive. So when observers noticed that key elements of that order were missing or altered, curiosity deepened. Again, not proof, not certainty, but friction. Consider this. When previous royal women were pregnant, the palace followed a predictable choreography. Announcements were brief but firm. Medical teams were referenced. Timelines were clear even when details were private. The message was always the same. Everything is handled. Everything is proper. Everything is as it should be. Now contrast that with what critics say happened here. The announcements were different in tone. The timelines appeared fluid. The protocols, at least publicly, seemed relaxed, reinterpreted, or quietly abandoned. Supporters argue this was intentional modernization, a break from invasive traditions, a humane update to a rigid system. And that argument has weight. But here's where the contradiction emerges. Modernization was selective. Some traditions were discarded in the name of privacy, while others were embraced when they enhanced narrative control. Ask yourself this. If tradition is outdated, why invoke it selectively? If privacy is paramount, why stage moments of visibility at all? That inconsistency became the core issue. Not what was done, but why it was done only sometimes. Royal watchers began compiling side-by-side comparisons. Not to mock, not to shame, but to understand. Why was this pregnancy treated as both private and public, depending on circumstance? Why were certain protocols labeled archaic while others were carefully preserved? And perhaps most importantly, why wasn't this explained? The monarchy has always understood one thing very well. Explanation prevents speculation. So when explanation is absent, people assume intention. Let's talk about the hospital tradition, because it's central to this chapter. For decades, royal births followed a symbolic ritual. A brief appearance, a controlled image, proof of continuity delivered in the least invasive way possible. Critics argue that the symbolism mattered more than the image itself. It wasn't about voyeurism. It was about reassurance. This happened. The line continues. The institution is intact. So when that ritual didn't occur here, the explanation was simple on the surface. Times have changed. Privacy matters. Boundaries deserve respect. Again, reasonable. But then came the next question. If privacy was the goal, why were other deeply personal moments shared? Why interviews? Why emotional disclosures? Why selective access? This wasn't a rejection of visibility. It was a reshaping of it. And reshaping narratives requires trust. Trust that audiences will accept the new rules without question. But trust is fragile, especially when the institution enforcing those rules has a history of secrecy. Royal pregnancies are also heavily documented internally. Records exist. Certifications exist. Protocols exist. And while the public doesn't need access to all of that, the knowledge that it exists is usually enough. In this case, critics claim the usual assurances felt absent, not replaced, just missing. Supporters counter that documentation exists regardless of public acknowledgement. That silence doesn't equal absence. That may be true, but perception matters more than reality in public institutions. And perception was shifting. Another comparison intensified scrutiny. Timing. Past royal pregnancies followed remarkably consistent announcement schedules. Even when births were kept private, confirmation was immediate and unambiguous. In this case, critics argue the timeline felt less anchored, more narrative-driven, adjusted as needed rather than fixed. Is that unusual? Possibly not. But unusual is enough to spark interest. And interest feeds investigation. Some observers noticed that language around the pregnancy felt more emotional and less procedural than tradition dictated. That may sound insignificant. It isn't. Institutions choose language with care, especially ones built on ceremony. So when tone shifts, it signals either evolution or strategy. Which one was this? That's the unresolved question. Now here's where emotions complicate everything. Comparing royal pregnancies means comparing women, bodies, experiences. That's dangerous territory. Many supporters rightly objected to what felt like invasive scrutiny masquerading as analysis. And some criticism absolutely crossed lines. But others insisted their focus wasn't the woman. It was the institution. The system that claims legitimacy through tradition suddenly bending those traditions without explanation. That's a structural issue, not a personal one. But nuance rarely survives online. The debate polarized. Either you believed the pregnancy narrative without question, or you were accused of cruelty. That binary eliminated space for curiosity. And curiosity doesn't disappear when suppressed. It mutates. It goes underground. People stopped asking openly and started researching quietly. Digging through historical precedent. Consulting royal correspondence. Rewatching archival footage from decades past. And the more they compared, the more the differences stood out. Not just in one area, but across multiple dimensions. Announcement style. Visibility choices. Medical references. Media coordination. Each difference alone explained easily. All of them together? That's where tension lives. Let's be clear again. Difference does not equal deception. But difference without explanation invites doubt. And doubt spreads fastest when people feel talked down to rather than informed. One recurring defense from supporters was this: she didn't owe anyone anything. That's emotionally compelling. But the monarchy is not an ordinary family. It is a public institution funded by public money whose legitimacy depends on public confidence. Those two realities clash constantly, and this pregnancy became a flashpoint for that clash. Was it a personal experience deserving total privacy? Or was it an institutional event requiring minimal transparency? The answer, apparently, was both. And that duality confused people. Some saw empowerment. Others saw manipulation. Neither side fully convinced the other. Then came retrospective analysis. Once tensions between the Sussexes and the palace became public, observers reinterpreted earlier events through a new lens. What once looked like independence now looked like defiance. What once looked like privacy now looked like control. This isn't fair, but it is human. Narratives are never static. They evolve with context, and the context had changed dramatically. The palace, for its part, never stepped in to clarify the historical deviations. No statement explaining modernization. No reassurance about continuity. No effort to bridge old expectations with new realities. Just distance. And distance breeds theories. By the end of this chapter in the story, the question had shifted again. It was no longer, is something off? It became, why was this allowed to feel off? Because institutions obsessed with optics don't usually leave ambiguity unresolved. Unless ambiguity serves a purpose. What purpose? That question sets the stage for the next phase of scrutiny. Because once observers stopped focusing on appearances and started examining documentation, or the alleged lack of it, the story took a far more serious turn. Not emotional, not visual, procedural. And that's where things stopped feeling speculative and started feeling institutional. But what people think they couldn't find, what critics claim was missing, and why that absence matters so much. What if the most important evidence isn't what people saw, but what they say they couldn't find? Because once attention shifted away from coats and camera angles, the conversation hardened. It stopped being visual. It became procedural, and that's when things turned serious. Chapter 3 begins with a blunt realization that unsettled even some supporters. In the royal system, paperwork is power. Births aren't just celebrated. They're recorded, logged, certified, cross-referenced. Not for gossip, but for legitimacy. Succession, law, history. That's why, when critics began saying the paper trail doesn't look the same, the tone of the discussion changed overnight. No more screenshots. No more freeze frames. This was about records. Or more precisely, about what people expected to exist and couldn't publicly verify. Now pause. Take a breath. This is where misunderstandings often explode. The public does not have automatic access to royal documentation. The absence of public access does not equal the absence of documents. That distinction matters. But so does expectation. Because for generations, the monarchy didn't just keep records. It signaled their existence clearly and consistently. And critics argue that this time, the signaling felt muted. Let's talk about what people expected to see, not because they're entitled to it, but because history conditioned them to expect reassurance. In previous royal births, the palace typically acknowledged medical oversight in carefully worded ways, without naming doctors, without revealing personal details, just enough to anchor the event in institutional procedure. Statements followed familiar formulas. The Duchess was safely delivered of. Both mother and child are doing well. The medical team. These phrases aren't accidental. They're ritualistic. So when people reread the announcements connected to this birth, some felt the language was different. Not absent. Not scandalous. Just less anchored to the usual formula. Why does that matter? Because in institutions, wording is documentation's public shadow. And when shadows change shape, people look for the object casting them. Critics began asking a specific question. Where's the confirmation trail? Not because they demanded medical files, but because they were accustomed to seeing symbolic markers that those files existed. Instead, they encountered vagueness. Supporters countered immediately. Privacy, modernization, boundaries, all valid. But here's the contradiction that reignited debate. If privacy was the priority, why were other aspects of the story so carefully publicized? Why emotional interviews discussing deeply personal topics? Why selective sharing of images and timelines? Why protect documentation while showcasing narrative? That imbalance made some observers uneasy, and discomfort invites investigation. Online researchers, again, not a monolith, began cataloging public statements, press releases, palace clarifications, comparing them line by line to those from earlier royal births. They weren't looking for smoking guns. They were looking for consistency. What they claimed they found instead was inconsistency. Some announcements were delayed. Some phrasing was unprecedented. Some expected follow-ups never came. Individually, these are minor. Collectively, they became suspicious to critics. Let's address the elephant in the room. The law. Royal births aren't just ceremonial. They have legal implications tied to succession. That's why, historically, procedures existed to remove doubt. Those procedures evolved over time, but their purpose remained the same. Certainty. And certainty isn't emotional. It's administrative. Critics argue that the modern handling of this birth relied too heavily on trust and too little on visible structure. Supporters argue that trust should be enough. So who's right? That depends on how you view institutions. Do you believe public trust should replace visible process? Or do you believe visible process is what earns trust in the first place? This is where the debate fractured. Some people accepted the palace's implicit assurance. Others felt reassurance had been replaced with narrative management. And once narrative management becomes the dominant lens, everything looks strategic. Consider how quickly critics were dismissed. Rather than addressing procedural questions, responses focused on morality, on compassion, on mental health, on misogyny. Important conversations, but not answers to procedural curiosity. That mismatch intensified frustration. People weren't asking, why does she deserve privacy? They were asking, why does this institution feel different now? And those questions remained unanswered. Another detail fueled suspicion: the lack of a clearly acknowledged medical authority in public statements. Historically, royal births were overseen by identifiable medical teams, not for publicity, but for legitimacy. In this case, the absence of that reference, or its ambiguity, became a talking point. Again, absence of mention does not equal absence of care. But public institutions are judged on what they communicate, not what they internally know. And communication felt selective. Critics began using phrases like paper trail loosely, sometimes irresponsibly. That didn't help. It blurred the line between legitimate curiosity and conspiracy. But even sloppy language doesn't erase underlying unease. Here's another uncomfortable truth. When institutions choose not to clarify, they cede narrative control to speculation. And speculation is rarely kind. The palace's strategy appeared to be disengagement. No rebuttals. No clarifications. No effort to contextualize the changes. Just silence. And silence, in this environment, became evidence in the minds of skeptics. That's dangerous. Because silence can mean many things: respect, legal caution, avoidance, or simply fatigue. But without explanation, people choose the meaning that fits their suspicion. Some defenders argued that addressing rumors would legitimize them. That's often true. But ignoring procedural questions while condemning emotional ones created confusion. It felt like the palace was saying, trust us, but don't ask why. And trust doesn't work that way anymore. Not in a digital world where archives never disappear. Not after decades of revelations about institutional secrecy. Another layer complicated everything: the breakdown of the Sussexes' relationship with the royal family. Once that rupture became public, every earlier ambiguity was reinterpreted. Was silence about paperwork a kindness or distance? Was vagueness a shield or a warning? People began speculating not just about what existed, but about who controlled it. And control is a loaded word. Who controlled the narrative? Who controlled the timing? Who controlled the information flow? Those questions drifted dangerously close to power dynamics. And power dynamics always attract scrutiny. At this stage, even neutral observers felt uneasy. Not convinced, but unsettled. And that's a dangerous place for institutions. Because unease doesn't demand belief. It only demands attention. Some legal analysts weighed in cautiously. Not asserting wrongdoing, not validating rumors, just noting that deviation from established documentation norms, even when lawful, carries reputational risk. In other words, even if everything was proper, it didn't look proper to some observers. And in monarchy, appearance is half the substance. Supporters pushed back hard. They accused critics of bad faith, of obsession, of cruelty disguised as curiosity. Some of those accusations were deserved, but blanket dismissal swept legitimate questions away with the malicious ones. And when people feel dismissed, they stop listening. They double down. By the end of this phase, the conversation had transformed. It was no longer about whether something looked odd. It was about whether institutions could ask for trust while refusing transparency. That's a universal issue, far bigger than this story. And that's why this narrative gained traction beyond royal watchers. It tapped into a cultural nerve. People everywhere questioning authority. People everywhere re-examining official stories. People everywhere tired of being told, "This is settled," without explanation. This story became symbolic, not of deception, but of distrust. And distrust doesn't need proof to spread. It only needs uncertainty. The alleged missing paper trail wasn't a fact. It was a perception, and perceptions drive behavior. By the end of Chapter 3, the debate had crossed a line. It was no longer confined to fringe forums. Mainstream commentators began acknowledging the existence of questions, even if they rejected their conclusions. That acknowledgement alone legitimized curiosity. And curiosity doesn't retreat easily. Because once people believe something procedural was hidden, whether true or not, they begin asking a darker question. If this wasn't handled the way it usually is, what else was different? And that question pulls the story forward. Out of paperwork, out of protocol, and straight into the most visible absence of all. The moment the world expected to see. And never did. Why did the moment everyone expected never happen? Because in the monarchy, symbolism is language. And when a symbol disappears, people don't just notice, they interpret. This chapter begins with an absence. Not a scandal, not a leak. An absence. The hospital steps. For generations, that brief appearance, sometimes just seconds long, served a purpose far greater than the image itself. It wasn't about smiles or fashion. It wasn't about satisfying curiosity. It was about closure, a visual full stop. This happened. The line continues. The institution stands. So when that moment didn't occur, the reaction wasn't outrage. It was confusion. At first, supporters defended the decision instantly. Why should she be paraded? Times have changed. Privacy matters. And they were right, in principle. But here's where the story takes its turn. Because the hospital steps weren't just tradition. They were a solution to a problem the monarchy had faced centuries earlier: doubt. Historically, royal births were shrouded in suspicion. That's why rituals evolved. To remove ambiguity. To prevent rumor. To anchor legitimacy in something visible and uncontested. The irony? The very tradition designed to prevent speculation was now gone, and speculation exploded. Ask yourself this. If the goal was privacy, why not replace the ritual with a modern equivalent? A brief statement. A controlled image. A symbolic gesture acknowledging continuity without spectacle. Instead, there was nothing. And in an age where silence is interpreted as strategy, that nothing spoke loudly. Let's rewind to the hours after the birth announcement. Media outlets scrambled. Cameras waited. Commentators speculated about timing and logistics. The expectation wasn't entitlement, it was precedent. Everyone assumed some version of acknowledgement would come. It didn't. Instead, the narrative shifted quickly forward. New statements. New images at later dates. The story moved on without closing the loop. And that's when questions hardened. Why skip the one moment designed to silence doubt? Supporters argued that modern royal women deserve autonomy. True. But here's the contradiction critics couldn't ignore. Autonomy was exercised selectively. There were carefully staged appearances afterward, controlled releases, strategic interviews. So the refusal wasn't about visibility. It was about timing and control. Why refuse the moment that provides certainty while embracing moments that shape emotion? That inconsistency became the focal point. People began revisiting the symbolism. The hospital steps moment isn't about proving biology. It's about proving process. It shows that the event occurred within the expected institutional framework. When that framework is absent, observers fill the gap with interpretation. And interpretation can be cruel. Some critics argued the absence was intentional, a way to avoid scrutiny during a period of heightened tension with the palace. Supporters countered that the tension itself justified withdrawal. Both narratives can coexist. but neither resolves the unease. What intensified scrutiny was how quickly the palace seemed to accept the deviation without explanation. No statement contextualizing the change. No acknowledgement of public expectation. No reassurance that continuity remained intact. Just a quiet pivot. In earlier eras, deviations were explained, even controversial ones. This time, explanation was absent. And absence became the story. Royal correspondents, even sympathetic ones, admitted the decision was unprecedented. Not wrong, just new. And new things require framing. Without framing, they invite suspicion. Here's another layer people often overlook. The hospital steps moment historically removed the need for ongoing discussion. It ended the story. Without it, the story lingered. Weeks later, months later, years later. Still lingering. And lingering stories attract reinterpretation. As the Sussexes' relationship with the media and the palace deteriorated publicly, that absence was reread through a harsher lens. What once felt like empowerment began to look like avoidance to some observers. Again, not proof, but perception shifts with context. Some commentators suggested the decision was driven by security concerns. Others cited mental health. Both plausible, but none were officially confirmed. And that left a vacuum. In that vacuum, speculation didn't just survive, it matured. People stopped asking, why didn't we see it? They started asking, why didn't they replace it? That's a crucial distinction. No one demanded tradition for tradition's sake. They wanted reassurance. A modern monarchy can change rituals, but it must replace their function. The function here was certainty. Without certainty, doubt metastasizes. Another uncomfortable detail surfaced. In past royal births, the hospital steps appearance wasn't optional. It was expected. When deviations occurred, they were explained. This time, expectation was ignored rather than addressed. That felt like a rupture in the social contract. And social contracts, once broken, are difficult to repair. Critics also pointed to timing inconsistencies around the birth announcement itself. Not definitive, but confusing. Confusion layered onto absence created narrative instability. And unstable narratives don't age well. The media, sensing risk, treaded carefully. Most avoided the topic entirely. But avoidance didn't kill interest. It signaled taboo. And taboo fuels obsession. Online, people began reframing the absence as the central mystery. Not the pregnancy, not the body language, not the paperwork. The missing moment. The thing everyone expected and never received. Some supporters argued the public wasn't owed reassurance. That's a moral argument. But monarchy operates on a symbolic economy, not a moral one. Symbols exist to maintain belief. And belief weakens when symbols disappear without explanation. This wasn't about one woman's autonomy. It was about an institution's continuity. Two values collided, and neither yielded gracefully. As the years passed, the absence took on mythic weight. It became a shorthand. The steps. 3 words that encapsulated every unresolved question. Even people who rejected conspiracy theories admitted the decision was mishandled. Not wrong. Mishandled. Because handling change requires communication. And communication was minimal. The palace may have believed silence was protective. Instead, it became provocative. And provocation invites reinterpretation. Here's the most damaging consequence. The missing hospital steps moment allowed critics to connect unrelated doubts into a single narrative. Paperwork questions, timeline confusion, protocol deviations, all anchored to one visible absence. Once that anchor existed, everything else seemed to orbit it. And when narratives orbit, they accelerate. Now consider this. If the palace had offered a single modern replacement, a brief statement explaining the change, affirming continuity, acknowledging tradition while redefining it, would this story exist today? Probably not. But that didn't happen. And so the absence became permanent. Not just in footage, in memory. By the end of this chapter in the public conversation, something had shifted irrevocably. The debate was no longer about respect versus privacy. It was about trust versus opacity. And once trust is questioned, every future statement is filtered through doubt. That's why, years later, a single phrase could reignite everything. A phrase interpreted as denial, or clarification, or something else entirely. Because once a symbol disappears, words take on enormous weight. And the next chapter is all about words. Dates, timelines, Moments that didn't line up cleanly. Moments that, according to critics, refused to stay still. And when time itself becomes flexible in a narrative, why did the dates keep moving? That was the question that refused to settle once people stopped debating symbols and started tracking time itself. Because timelines don't lie, unless they're being rewritten. Chapter 5 opens with something deceptively simple. A calendar. Not a rumor. Not a theory. Just dates. Dates of announcements. Dates of appearances. Dates referenced in interviews. Dates hinted at in statements. And when critics laid them side by side, something didn't feel fixed. At first, the discrepancies were tiny, almost laughable. A day here, a phrasing there, a shortly before, that later sounded like weeks earlier. Easy to dismiss. But timelines don't unravel in one dramatic snap. They stretch. They bend. They accumulate tension until people start asking a more unsettling question. Why isn't this anchored? Royal events are usually time-stamped with near-military precision. Not because the public demands it, but because institutions crave order. Births especially. They're among the few moments where the monarchy is expected to be unambiguous, clear, final. So when observers noticed that the timing around this birth seemed unusually fluid, curiosity hardened into suspicion. Let's be clear again. A flexible timeline does not prove deception, but it does invite interpretation. And interpretation thrives where clarity is absent. The first point of confusion centered on the announcement itself. When exactly did the birth occur? When was the palace informed? When was the public informed? In previous royal births, these moments were tightly aligned. Not necessarily immediate, but consistent. Here, critics argue the sequence felt less linear. Announcements appeared after the fact. Details emerged later. Clarifications followed clarifications. Supporters explained this as modern discretion. Fair. But here's the contradiction. Discretion didn't prevent subsequent media engagement. It didn't prevent interviews. It didn't prevent selective emotional disclosures. So discretion applied to timing, but not to narrative. Why? That question lingered. Then came the appearances. Observers began mapping public engagements against reported stages of pregnancy. Again, dangerous territory. Bodies are not clocks. Pregnancies vary. Assumptions are risky. But critics weren't measuring bodies. They were measuring schedules. Why was a late-stage appearance scheduled with such physical intensity? Why were long-distance trips undertaken so close to reported milestones? Why did official language sometimes sound retrospective rather than immediate? Each question alone is harmless. Together, they form a pattern that some say felt managed rather than organic. Then interviews entered the equation. Retrospective storytelling always reshapes timelines. That's normal. But when those stories include phrases like around that time or shortly after, without anchoring, they create narrative elasticity. Elastic narratives stretch to fit emotion. Institutional narratives are supposed to resist that. And that's where critics felt something fundamental had changed. The monarchy appeared to be speaking like an individual rather than an institution. More feeling, less structure. And structure is how institutions earn trust. Another layer added complexity. Press corrections, small edits, quiet updates, rephrase captions. Nothing scandalous. But each correction fed a growing belief among skeptics that the story was being refined after the fact rather than recorded in real time. That belief may be unfair, but perception doesn't need fairness to spread. Now let's address a key point supporters often raise. Memory isn't perfect. Absolutely true. But this wasn't just memory. It was official communication. Institutions usually lock timelines early to avoid exactly this problem. So why didn't that happen here? Critics offered different interpretations. Some believe the palace deferred too much control to the Sussexes. Others believed the palace distanced itself deliberately. Still others believed legal caution shaped communication. All plausible, none confirmed. But the lack of confirmation didn't quiet speculation. It amplified it. Then came the phrase that haunted this chapter. Adjusted. Critics began accusing the narrative of being adjusted. Not fabricated, adjusted. Adjusted to avoid scrutiny. Adjusted to maintain flexibility. Adjusted to keep options open. That accusation is serious. But it didn't emerge in a vacuum. It emerged because timelines felt reactive rather than fixed. And reactive narratives always look suspicious in hindsight. Another contradiction fueled distrust. When critics pointed out timeline confusion, responses focused on intent rather than clarity. You're being cruel. You're overthinking. You're obsessed. None of those address the timeline itself. They address motivation. And when questions about facts are answered with judgments about character, people feel dismissed. Dismissal breeds defiance. People doubled down. They built spreadsheets. They annotated videos. They cross-referenced interviews with press releases. Again, not because they were certain, but because they felt something wasn't being explained. Here's the part many people avoid saying out loud. If everything had been straightforward, clarification would have been easy. A single timeline. A single statement. A single anchor. Instead, the story remained fluid. And fluid stories invite suspicion, even when undeserved. Another element intensified scrutiny. The Sussexes' eventual departure from royal duties. Once that rupture occurred, earlier ambiguity was reinterpreted as early warning. People asked whether the timeline flexibility was a symptom of deeper conflict. Were communications fractured internally? Was coordination lacking? Were narratives competing? Those questions expanded the scope beyond the pregnancy. This wasn't just about birth timing anymore. It was about institutional coherence. When institutions speak with one voice, timelines stabilize. When they don't, timelines fracture. And fractures tell stories of their own. Some royal correspondents cautiously acknowledged timeline confusion without endorsing conspiracy. That acknowledgement alone legitimized discussion. Because once mainstream voices say this was unusual, curiosity becomes acceptable. Still, no comprehensive explanation came. No consolidated timeline. No official retrospective clarification. Just forward motion. And forward motion without resolution leaves ghosts behind. By this point, even people who rejected extreme theories admitted the situation had been handled poorly. Not dishonestly, poorly. Poor handling creates room for reinterpretation. And reinterpretation becomes belief when repeated often enough. The timeline issue also connected back to earlier chapters. Paperwork questions. Hospital steps absence. Protocol deviations. All of them hinged on timing. When did things happen? When were decisions made? Who knew what and when? Those questions formed the backbone of trust. And trust felt strained. Another uncomfortable reality surfaced. Modern audiences expect transparency not because they're entitled, but because they've been trained to detect narrative manipulation. Marketing, politics, media. People know how stories are shaped. So when a story feels shaped rather than documented, alarms ring. That doesn't mean deception occurred, but it does mean belief erodes. And erosion doesn't need proof. It needs repetition. By the end of this phase, the pregnancy narrative wasn't just questioned, it was destabilized. Not replaced by an alternative truth, but surrounded by doubt. And doubt is powerful, because doubt doesn't demand certainty. It only demands the possibility that something else might be true. At this stage, critics shifted again. They stopped asking, why don't the dates line up? They started asking, why does this feel choreographed? That shift changed everything. Because choreography implies intent, and intent implies strategy, which leads to a much darker conversation. Not about when things happened, but about how they were presented, and how much control was exercised over perception itself. That's where this story turns from procedural curiosity to visual obsession. Because once timelines felt flexible, people stopped trusting dates. They started trusting what they thought they could see. Bodies, movement, clothing. And that opened the most volatile chapter yet. One filled with images, interpretations, and debates that exploded far beyond reason. And once that door opened, there was no closing it again. What happens when people stop trusting words and start trusting their eyes? Because once timelines felt unstable, attention snapped back to the most dangerous kind of evidence there is. Visual evidence. Chapter 6 begins where logic starts to give way to instinct. Bodies, movement, clothing, angles. Moments frozen mid-step and replayed until meaning is forced onto them. This is where the conversation became explosive. Because once interpretation moves from documents to bodies, emotion takes over. And emotion does not care about fairness. It cares about certainty. The body language debate didn't begin as accusation. It began as observation. People noticing how often hands rested on the stomach, how coats were structured, how posture changed from one appearance to the next. Again, on their own, Meaningless. Pregnancy looks different on everyone. Bodies fluctuate. Clothing exaggerates and conceals. That's all true. But here's the critical shift. These observations didn't exist in a vacuum. They arrived after missing traditions, after shifting timelines, after procedural ambiguity. Context transforms interpretation. What might have been dismissed instantly under normal circumstances now felt relevant. And relevance is dangerous when certainty is absent. Short thought. This is where things went too far for many people. Longer breath. But this is also where curiosity crossed into obsession for others. The internet began doing what it always does. Zooming, cropping, slowing footage to fractions of a second. Fashion analysts weighed in, cautiously at first. They talked about tailoring, about how structured coats can create illusions, about how movement can change silhouette. Medical professionals urged restraint. They reminded people that pregnancy is not linear, that bodies swell and recede, that movement is deceptive on camera. These voices mattered, but they were drowned out. Because once people believe they are seeing inconsistency, they look for it everywhere. And once you look for something, you will find it. This is confirmation bias in real time. The debate reached peak intensity around a handful of widely circulated clips. Clips that critics replayed endlessly. Clips that supporters dismissed as cruel misinterpretation. And here's the problem. Both sides were partially right. Some interpretations were reckless. Some dismissals were defensive. Nuance vanished. The conversation turned toxic. Any attempt to contextualize visuals was framed as gaslighting. Any attempt to question visuals was framed as hatred. And once a debate becomes moralized, evidence becomes secondary. Ask yourself this. Have you ever watched the same clip twice and noticed something new the second time? Now imagine doing that thousands of times with thousands of strangers reinforcing the same interpretation. That's how meaning calcifies. One coat became symbolic. One movement became emblematic. One photograph became proof for some and disgusting obsession for others. And the internet does not do middle ground. Supporters argued, correctly, that no woman should have her body dissected this way. They were right. Critics argued that public narratives invite public scrutiny. They were also right. Those two truths collided violently, and no one won. But the damage was done. Because once visuals become evidence in the public imagination, no amount of clarification erases them. Here's where contradiction deepened. If visuals were meaningless, why were some appearances so carefully staged? Why specific angles? Why controlled walkabouts? Why particular clothing silhouettes repeated? Fashion choices are communication, especially in the royal world. Supporters say this is standard media management. Critics say it suggests narrative shaping. Again, both interpretations can coexist, but coexistence requires trust, and trust was already eroding. Another detail escalated the debate. Inconsistency. Critics claimed the visual presentation varied dramatically from one appearance to another in ways they felt were difficult to reconcile. Supporters pointed out pregnancy progression isn't linear. Both statements are true. But here's the psychological catch. When people expect consistency and see variation, they assume manipulation, even when none exists. This is the curse of public storytelling. Once you control some moments, people assume you control all of them. The body language debate became the most emotionally charged phase of this entire controversy. Not because it was the strongest evidence, but because it felt the most personal. Supporters felt violated on Meghan's behalf. Critics felt dismissed and silenced. Each side felt morally superior. And moral superiority kills dialogue. Let's address the ugliest truth here. Some people enjoyed the scrutiny. They framed it as investigation, but it was voyeurism. That doesn't invalidate all questions, but it does poison the well. And once poison spreads, even good faith inquiry becomes suspect. The palace, notably, said nothing. No defense. No condemnation. No attempt to redirect the conversation toward facts. Silence again. And silence, in this context, was interpreted as avoidance by critics and restraint by supporters. Same action, opposite interpretations. This is what happens when trust collapses. Every move means everything. Another shift occurred. People stopped focusing on isolated clips and started compiling timelines of appearances. Which clothing was worn when? How posture appeared across weeks? How silhouettes changed relative to reported stages? This level of scrutiny would be unacceptable in any other context. But monarchy operates under abnormal rules. Public symbolism invites abnormal attention. Still, many observers felt this crossed an ethical line. And they weren't wrong. But ethical discomfort didn't stop curiosity. It intensified it. Because when people feel censored, they move their discussions elsewhere. Private forums, encrypted chats, closed communities, places where moderation is minimal and speculation flourishes unchecked. That's where the most extreme interpretations took root. And once extreme ideas exist, they bleed outward. Even those who reject them must now contend with them. That's the paradox. Suppressing discussion doesn't eliminate ideas. It radicalizes them. Another contradiction sharpened mistrust. Supporters insisted visuals prove nothing. Critics replied, then why did visuals matter when they supported the official narrative? Why celebrate glowing images when they reassure, but condemn scrutiny when they confuse? That selective logic eroded credibility. Again, not proof. But credibility lost doesn't need proof. It needs inconsistency. As years passed, the body language debate hardened into myth. Certain clips became canonical. Certain interpretations became fixed. Even people who hadn't watched the footage repeated conclusions. That's how narratives solidify. They stop being about evidence. They become about identity. Which side are you on? Once a debate becomes tribal, facts become weapons, and truth becomes collateral damage. Some neutral commentators tried to reset the conversation. They argued that visuals are unreliable, that institutional questions should focus on protocol, not bodies. They were largely ignored. Because visuals are emotionally satisfying. They give people the illusion of certainty. You can point to an image and say, I saw it. That feels stronger than saying, I inferred it. But images lie. Angles lie. Lighting lies. Memory lies. And yet images dominate modern belief. By the end of this phase, the controversy had reached its most volatile state. Any mention of the topic triggered outrage. Any attempt to discuss visuals triggered accusations. The debate became unproductive, but it didn't disappear. It retreated, waiting, because unresolved tension doesn't evaporate. It sleeps, and then it wakes up when given a new frame, a new word, a new phrase, a new allegation. And that's exactly what happened next. Because after visuals came whispers, not about appearance, but about possibility, a word that had once been taboo, a subject no one wanted to touch.